and you can see their names on the invitation. I won't take the time to introduce them. I'd like to invite our moderator, Dr. Tara Sinclair, to take over. Dr. Sinclair is an expert in big data and economic forecasting. Tara?
Great, thank you so much, Susan, and thank you for the opportunity to be here today. I think this is going to be a really exciting and interesting discussion. Bugge, who's here as the Assistant Director of National Accounts at Statistics Canada. We have Jan Carrière-Swallow, who's an economist in the Policy Strategy and Review at the International Monetary Fund. And we have Vikram Haksar, who is the Assistant Director of the Macrofinancial Analysis at the International Monetary Fund. So welcome, thanks to all of y'all for participating in our discussion today. And where I'd like to get started is the question we always get asked whenever we say that we study data, which is what is special about data and how does data differ from other inputs, particularly as we're thinking about them as an economic resource. And I'd like to just open this one up to all three of y'all to kind of give your introductory perspective on data. So Brenda, let's start with you.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for having me. So when we think about data, we don't necessarily think of it as an economic resource or production input. Normally, we think of our traditional inputs into production, such as your labor and your capital. When we're talking about capital, we're talking about your machine in your manufacturing plant or the tractor that's in a construction site. Data is intangible. So how do we see data when it flows through an economic production process? Because so many businesses and governments are using data to exploit it or target their activities, it is an important input into our economic production process.
Great, thanks, Brenda. Jan, let's turn it over to you.
Sure, thanks very much, Tara. So I mean, we often hear this comparison thrown around that data is the new oil. Right, you could read this all over the place, and that's a very alluring kind of turn of phrase. But I think it's sort of only partly right. So data looks like other inputs in the production function to the extent that it can be valuable and it's important, as Brenda was saying, for many companies. But it's got some characteristics that are quite unlike the other inputs that we're used to dealing with, and I think that's one of the reasons that we struggle with how to measure it in the national accounts, for instance. One is the data is non-rivalrous. So, many people can use it at the same time, not like an oil well or a barrel of oil that you pulled out of it. My use of data doesn't preclude you or anyone else using it at the same time for the same or other ends. So that's very different, and we can talk a bit later about what that means. Another thing is that data is partially excludable. So because it sits on networks, you really have to spend money to stop it from being used indiscriminately by other people, right? So cybersecurity becomes the things you have to actively spend money on in order to preserve this resource. So that makes it a bit different than others. Another one is that you get important externalities from the collection of data through privacy channels. So the fact is that when I collect a piece of data about you, and then I decide to do something with it, like sell it to a third party, or maybe extract some insight that I can use for commercial benefit, that can affect you by compromising your privacy or putting you at a strategic disadvantage when you enter into a future commercial relationship. So these externalities are pervasive in the data economy. Now, this is, of course, there are externalities and there are other non-rivalrous inputs, but I think data looks quite different from sort of the typical machines and labor that Brenda was alluding to.
Great, thanks, Jan. And actually, before we transition to Vikram, let me remind y'all that I have a few questions that I would like to ask the panelists, but I'm also very keen to see your questions as well. So there's the Q&A box. So as you're hearing the panelists answers to these initial questions, start thinking of your questions and go ahead and put them in the Q&A as well so we can get to those. But Vikram, I would love to hear your views as well on why data is special.
Thanks, Tara. Before I remark, I should just maybe say on behalf of both Jan and myself that our comments here are private views and should not be taken as views representing the views of IMF management or its executive board. Sorry, I have to say the disclaimer always. Maybe just to add a couple of additional perspectives on what's special about data. So I think one topic that we're going to grapple increasingly with is who owns the data. Whose data are we talking about? And I think that's, we don't normally think about ownership when it comes to this. It's difficult to define ownership in the space of data, right? And I think that also ties into the question of the value of data, which I'm sure we'll talk about a little bit more. So, maybe my individual point of data is not that particularly valuable, but once it is accumulated and agglomerated and then analyzed, it gets value. And then the question comes up, whose value is it? Who does it belong to? So I think that's an unusual feature of data that is less of an issue with other inputs where ownership might be more clearly defined. And frankly, even when it comes to intangible assets like intellectual property, where we have very clear regimes for who owns and who controls and who derives benefit from the use of data. And I think a related issue out here is, especially in the context of the internet economy, is the value of data something that comes from the data itself, or is the value what comes from the data being part of a network? How much of it is the network, the platform, how much of it is actually the individual data? So these are kind of questions which I think come up and raise issues about the use of data. And when you think about it from an economic policy perspective, there are many challenges that come up in terms of how you think about regulating and managing this. I'm sure we'll talk about this as well, but data is given away. You give your data, you get services for free, but are you really getting them for free? What's on the other side in another market? Those kind of questions I think are very particular to data, which are quite interesting.
Great, thank you all for sharing those different views on this. It seems like we've got a lot to talk about. So this next question, I'd like to aim it at Brenda and Jan, Brenda and Vikram in particular. When we think about how data contributes to and affects the economy, we know it comes in a lot of different directions, as you've already hinted. I'd love to know more about how you're thinking about it, and also through what channels the data is contributing to and affecting the economy. Brenda, could you start with that one?
I guess now that our economy is changing, and it's changing so rapidly, I think the impacts on the economy could also be changing as time goes on. Years ago, we would probably only see it into an isolated number of industries. Now you have all types of industries that are making use of data and trying to exploit it for their own benefit, whether it be digital platform services, or farming industries, or governments. It's actually now pervasive, the use of data and the gathering of data in order to exploit it analytically for the purposes of furthering business operations. I see it now as not only changing our employment landscape, our investment landscape, but I think a lot of companies now, even from car mechanics to big industry, are reevaluating how they do businesses, how they do their business to make sure that they can exploit this new opportunity, which is accessing and exploiting data.
Great, thanks. Vikram, over to you.
Thanks, Tara. That's a short question with a potentially very long answer, but maybe I'll just make a few quick points. So we think the data is potentially very impactful across multiple dimensions of the economy. We think it matters for growth and productivity. We think it matters for financial stability. We think it matters for equity issues, financial inclusion, among others. And we think that there's a very important dimension of how data matters for cross-border activities when it can solve problems in cross-border space. And let me give you a couple of examples just to make the point, and happy to talk about this further. So Jan touched on this already when he was talking about the use of data for productivity enhancing activities. So you can imagine that the example that he and I like to bandy about is self-driving cars, right? Self-driving cars basically hoover up, the program hoovers up a lot of data, analyzes it, and hopefully at the end of the day, you get a car eventually that can drive itself. So that would be an example of using very large amounts of personal data that would inform an algorithm that would then come up with a productivity enhancing solution that would generate aggregate effects. And there's a emerging literature that talks about potential productivity enhancing effects of the use of data on a large scale. I think the applications in finance are particularly interesting. There's some very nice research that basically makes the argument that by using individual data in very large numbers, you're going to be able to solve the classic problems in finance better, solve the information problems better. So a specific example would be credit scoring. Using big data, you should be able to come up with a better credit score with a credit bureau operation. So those are two examples. I think there are flip sides as well of data. It not only does it offer these types of benefits, but it also raises some challenges as well. And I'll give you one specific example of a recent paper which has actually received a lot of attention. So by the same token that the increased amount of data can help you solve problems in finance by allowing you to make better credit decisions, it also, to use a turn of phrase, allows the weaponization of price discrimination in a way. And you can see that in certain types of lending markets. And there's an important paper that's just come out in the Journal of Finance, which shows that if you use big data in housing lending in the United States, you would get more efficient outcomes and you'd get improved credit scoring and therefore be able to lend more. But using this kind of algorithmic approach to data actually introduces bias as well. And you would find that basically racially disadvantaged groups would receive less housing finance. And that's a pretty striking finding, I think, that is coming out of this. So there are pros and cons on both sides of the argument.
Wow, thank you both for those great insights. Now I'd love to turn to looking a little bit more deeply into what's been going on in Canada. So Brenda, could you talk a little bit about how Canada's developed the means of measuring the value of data, and also in terms of what do you think is what is measurable and how does that relate to what should be measured?
Thanks. So yes, 2 years ago, we released experimental estimates for the first ever estimates of value of data in Canada. We were the first National Statistical Office to do so. But even though we were the first, we did this in collaboration with the United States Bureau of Economic Analysis and also folks from OECD. What we did was we developed an information value chain. So that's how we identified what should be identified as data. And in general, we said any observations would not be considered production. So we did not value observations. But as soon as it was put into a digital format, we considered that data, and that would be an input into a production process. So in order to value that, we used what would be the sum of costs approach. So a technical term, but basically, what is the cost to make that data, to do that production process? So your labor input and your capital inputs. The reason we had to use this is there was a lack of market transactions that would fully cover the full or have full coverage of what would be the production of data assets. So using the sum of costs approach, we can approximate what would be that value within that data. We had a lot of difficulty with determining what occupations would actually be working with data, how much of that time would be working with data. So as a first group of estimates, we actually did a range, a lower and an upper bound, to give an idea of what type of occupations and their time range that would be spent in data activities. We use the sum of costs approach for other activities that are hard to measure with market transactions, such as some forms of research and development and some forms of own account. So basically you build something for your own use. So we did this for the value of data. Another component that was very difficult to identify is when we're measuring the stock of the value of data, because that would flow into what our net worth is for the economy. How do we determine what would be the depreciation profile of that asset? So we had to make some assumptions with regards to the ongoing storage of data. We assumed that corporations would keep their data for about a generation. So that would be the service life of that asset. So using those, we came up with what would be the investment portion of data, but also then the stock that would flow into the net worth. These estimates, of course, as I said, they were based on a variety of assumptions, and they were the first pass at experimental estimates. What we consider data would have been the first step of transferring observation to a digital format. There's also databases and data science that can also be used with data activities. Databases are sometimes mixed with software, and data science sometimes mixed with research and development. So as we go forward, we have to actually delineate which portions would already be captured with our other intangible assets that we measure, and what would be new estimations.
Wow, that's fascinating, Brenda. This actually connects in, part of your answer connects into one of the questions in the Q&A. So I'm going to jump to that. I do have another big question that I want to get back to you all on, but Rajiv DeMello asks, comparable to a perishable good, or does it get more valuable with time and with augmentation? And I thought that was particularly connected to your concept of the service life of that asset. So what's your view on that? And then maybe if Jan or Vikram want to jump in as well.
I think that's one of the main issues that we grapple with data. What might be valuable now might not be valuable from 5 years from now. What might not have been valuable 20 years ago might be valuable now. So how do we determine what would be the price of that asset? So that's why sum of costs is a good in-between measure, because we don't know what that asset could be valued at. We have a report that was done by one of our forestry agencies back in the 1960s. And it was not used. It was done. There was a lot of information gathered. It was put together. No one's used it. But in the last 10 years, requests for access to that study has grown exponentially because people have become aware of how important that information is with regards to climate change. So it might not have been that valuable in the 1960s, but it is valuable now because it helps inform where we're going with our policies.
Great, thanks. I see Jan would also like to jump in here. Go for it.
Just a quick point. I mean, this is one of the nice ways that data is really different from oil. So oil's a commodity, right? So the way that economists define a commodity is that they're homogeneous goods. You know, two pieces of oil are just always perfect substitutes with each other. That couldn't be farther from the truth for data, right? So almost never perfect substitutes. They're all infinitely different. And so when we think about you know, these types of questions, you know, will data be perishable or not? I mean, I think the only answer that we can give is it will depend, right? It'll depend on the type of data, the application, who collected it, what's it about, what's it for. And I think the points that Brenda's made are absolutely right. That, you know, something could be valuable to not tomorrow, and vice versa.
Thanks, Jan. So I see lots of questions are coming in the Q&A. I have one more big question I definitely want to make sure that we get to, but also please continue to add in your questions to the Q&A, and we will weave them in our discussion. So turning to you, Jan, so this is kind of a big question, and I know you have a big answer for it, but you know, many have argued that the US and China have comparative advantage in data-driven services because they have economies of scale and scope in the data. But other researchers have argued that accumulating more data over time does not necessarily improve the costs or result in better analytical systems, and may in fact lead to the opposite, where we might have, you know, higher storage, processing, and analysis costs. So are those who are seeing this advantage, is there some confusion between network effects and scale effects? And could you clarify that for all of us?
I can certainly try. There's a lot of intersecting important concepts packed into this question. So maybe we could start, from this contrarian observation that accumulation of data has decreasing returns to scale. And this is something that, is a really old stylized fact from computer science, right? When you add data to a data set, the marginal predictive gain that you get from that new piece of data as you make the data set bigger has decreasing returns to scale, right? And so when you conceive of data as an input in a prediction algorithm, like in AI, for instance. Sometimes you can, there's quite a strong tendency to think the larger the data set, you're going to run into decreasing marginal returns to that data as you go along. And I think this is true in a lot of observations. So why is that true? But also the other people are also right. So let's start by thinking about network effects, right? So let's say, you're a member of a social network. And then me, a friend of yours decides to join that social network. So what are we talking about when we talk about network effects? We're talking about me joining isn't just good for me because I get access to the network. It's also good for you and for all the other existing users because now you have a new person to talk to on the network. So this is the source of network effects. Now this intersects with data, right? Why does it intersect with data? But it's not exactly the same concept. So my joining the network is good for you because then you can talk to me. But my joining the network is also good because the network is now going to hoover up more of my data and add it to its data set. And on the basis of that, it can come up with new insights, develop new technologies, and deliver better services to all of the users on the network. Okay, so this is like data creating a new source of network effects, right? Not the same thing as economies of scale, but of course, it could be proportional with scale. So the two things are going to be a little bit mixed up. So this, these network effects generate huge commercial opportunities, right? And I think, this is self-evident to anyone who reads the business pages. There's a lot happening in the commercial space. It also generates a lot of implications for competition and for market structure. So there's big macro questions that are involved here. But that actually isn't the main reason that, some macro growth economists are excited about data proliferation. Right? That excitement really comes from the non-rivalrous nature of data. And that's the idea that, when Ford builds a new machine, with which to make its automobiles, the economy, gets a bit bigger. It's good to the extent that we all get more Ford cars, but it's not that we also get more Toyota and more Nissan and more everything else. That machine is just going to sit in the Ford factory and produce Ford cars. So there's kind of a limit to how much economic growth we can get from the accumulation of these machines. With data, the argument is that gets turned on its head, right? When we add a new data set to the economy, everybody can use it at the same time. Scientists can use it to do orthogonal tasks, right? You can use it to develop a new drug, or you can use it to sell products, or any number of different things all at the same time. And so this is where the economies of scale at a macro level would come from this non-rivalrous characteristic. Now, this is very much an idea that is describing the world as it could be rather than really the world as it is, right? So the world as it is, the data economy looks a lot more like a company collects a bunch of data and then walls it off and sits on it. And to the extent that that company decides to share access to it, either selling it to a third party or processing it for some other use or whatever that may be, it's making that decision because it views it as being in its own narrow commercial interest to do so, right? And so, speaking of non-rivalry is kind of, it's a little bit of a theoretical concept because in practice, we treat data in our economy as though it weren't really non-rivalrous. This is more of a potential than a description. So I think, going back to this question of what countries are going to have a comparative advantage, if we have economies of scale and data, I think this is the point that the US and China would have a comparative advantage here because they have a big population ultimately, would be true in a world where data didn't flow across borders, right? But of course, that's not the case. So, data does flow across borders and a lot. We can think of Facebook is based in the US. It's got 2 billion users. That's many multiples of the US population. Clearly, a lot of data is being imported to the US across the border through these networks, right? And so I think, this really speaks to the question of data. Data is the essential mobile factor of production, right? It's instantaneously, it can instantaneously exist in multiple countries at the same time and being used in multiple countries at the same time at almost zero cost to transfer, right? And so I think the question of which countries will have a comparative advantage here Sure, it'll have to do with the related inputs like skilled labor and computing power. Those are obviously very important. But fundamentally, it's a question of who has access to the data, right? And will that access be blocked at national borders? You know, some countries are moving in that direction for citing national security concerns or other concerns. Or will we have an economy with open free flow of data, in which case, you know, borders mean a lot less and data really can be accumulated across different dimensions.
Great, thanks, Jan. I knew that was a big question, and you did not disappoint with the big answer. So thanks so much. So we've got many questions coming in via Q&A, and please, if you have not put in a question yet, you're encouraged to do so. But a couple of questions that have come in, I think, touch on another area that I'd like us to get to, and then we can kind of dig in a little deeper on some of the things you've already said. We've got a question both about how do you distinguish data from content, as well as how do you ground truth from aggregate data versus thinking about machine learning algorithms. And the particular example that was given is that from the aggregate macro perspective may not occur with the disaggregated micro data. And so I think combining those two questions together in terms of data from content versus what we're learning, the machine learning on top of the data versus the underlying truth of data. Does anybody have any thoughts they'd like to jump in on one or both parts of those questions?
Hi, I can start. This is one of the reasons why it was so hard to determine what would be data and what would be, say, databases, what would be data science. The machine learning algorithm or the artificial intelligence algorithm, to me, is exploiting the data, and you're garnering some information based on those programs. You're spending the time to exploit that data and then find some interesting information. And I think this is one of the areas where in the international community we are struggling, because there is such an overlap between what we're already measuring, so for example, software or databases or research and development, that we need to be very careful with delineating what would be the data portion and what would be something else like the software or the research and development.
Great, thanks, Brenda. So kind of following along that theme a little bit further, a couple of people have asked about thinking about how how do we really want to think about the data, whether, for example, is it its collection is independent of the data generating process and the human behavior and the interactions between the humans contributing the data and then what they're getting for that data and that general feedback loop, and how basically how the data collection itself can change the way the data is generated. And thinking back onto some of your answers in particular, does that affect where it's, who's collecting it, where it's being collected? Does that affect its ability to be disseminated more broadly? Do you have?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with Brenda. This is just a struggle, right? I mean, distinguishing these things, I think conceptually you can distinguish them, but I think then in practice it's quite difficult to do so. So I think where to start? Maybe Vikram, do you want to start while I gather my thoughts?
Yeah, sure. I mean, again, this is a huge topic, right? And I think it's really interesting to be interacting with Brenda as well, because we've thought a lot about it from a sort of conceptual economics point of view, and clearly when you get down to brass tacks, well, how do we actually measure it? Really forces you to ask some pretty tough questions, right? And I think that's really interesting. I mean, I don't know if this is exactly an answer, but I think that one of the issues that we grapple with is that we argue that the market for data is not complete. So, right now I use search and I am giving my data and receiving a fantastic service in return. And is my data worth? How much is the search value? Is the search worth to me? How do you measure these things? And then, you know, I remember early in the process when we started investigating this, I was told that, well, the moment you do a search on any big search engine, they're running an instantaneous auction to auction the value of the search term, which I found kind of chilling in a certain way, but at the same time, it was kind of a token of the market. But I think one of the questions that we have ultimately is that clearly there are market mechanisms at play here. There is value being generated and value being assigned, but it's not very transparent. And it's not very clear that there's a clear legal or regulatory framework that determines, you know, how should this work and who has agency and control over the entire process. There's a lot of this debate, for example, UK, where they've had a new services review done, headed by Jason Furman out of Harvard. And they make the argument that, look, data markets are fundamentally sided markets. I mean, this is a big thing that's being discussed in Europe right now in the context of the reform of the data regulation frameworks there. And, you know, you may see a piece of one transaction in one market, but they're taking place in multiple markets, actually. And how do you actually then decide what the value is of the overall chain of transactions? And is it really as big as proponents of a data dividend, say, a la California might say it is actually? So I think it's very difficult to say. We have difficulty measuring it. We don't observe all the markets, the incomplete markets, incomplete transactions. So I think one of our arguments is that to make this work better and to make it clearer, it would be very helpful to have a framework for agency over data, which is not just a sort of a legal agency, but that actually sets up a market-based framework for saying, how do I control my data? How do I derive economic benefit and value from it? And I do not think that this is an easy question to answer, actually. It's not just about checking boxes and saying, you know, I consent to the cookies and all that. You know, it's really about how do you actually have effective control. And I think that's going to be one of the big questions to my mind that would be interesting to explore from an economic point of view.
All right,
if I could just,
sorry,
if I could just add to Vikram, that was great. And it prefaces what I am a strong believer in, that even what we think right now will not be the case 5 years from now. So, you know, whatever we decide on, we'll just have to keep on reevaluating. And, you know, as the economy changes, as people figure out new ways to do things with the data, we're going to have to keep changing as it goes along.
Great. Yeah, I'm really happy to be on the asking the questions side of this panel today. This is really great to hear that y'all are seeing these as really big questions, because I know they're challenging. So Jan, go for it.
I just want to say, I think there's, you know, it's easy to kind of characterize how we think this discussion, where the truth lies, you know. So I think Vikram and I have we've kind of described the current model as kind of a finders keepers model, you know, where if you're a company and you happen to have a customer who you're giving a service to, and that gives you access to measuring something about them, then good for you, and you can hang on to it, you know, without much strings attached. You know, the sort of Wild West kind of that is a bit of a caricaturization, obviously. But you know, the opposite is also true, right? Where people say, well, you know, if a piece of data gets recorded about me, then it's mine, right? Because I'm the DGP, right? And I mean, that's, I think, also only partly true, right? Because often the data is being recorded in the context of, say, a commercial transaction, right? So really what's being recorded is the fact that you engaged with someone else in an activity, and, you know, they're at least equally responsible for that activity having taken place. Now, to the extent that that activity reveals something about you as a customer, you know, who is the owner of that information and of that data, I think is just a really complicated, like there's no obvious answer to that. So I agree with the things that Vikram is saying. I mean, this is, you know, we're really advocating for trying to operationalize sort of user control over data. But I would hazard that it's not we shouldn't caricaturize that as just, you know, everything belongs to individuals, because I think that's kind of an oversimplification in the other direction. And one thing that's important is we need to make sure that in any economic system, you know, we preserve the incentives to collect data, to make sure that it's accurate, to make sure that it's properly stored, and that costs money, is expensive. And if we start treating it as just, something that is wholly the property of the individual, then, it's not clear how you'll get those incentives. So that's something to be mindful of.
Great.
Can I just add, Tara, can I just add to that point? Just to say that, and I think particularly in the current context of we're all in the pandemic world, right? I mean, there are many aspects of individual data. I think we have this issue of defining the boundary between privacy and the public good as well, right? There's an individual need and right, prerogative for privacy, but there are also public good, the public interest as well. And data, in many ways, individual data, highly sensitive individual data, ultimately in some ways is the ultimate public good as well, right? Public good in the real public finance kind of way of thinking about it, actually. And so, Jan and I have written about thinking about are there mechanisms by which we are able to both satisfy the individual privacy need while also allowing for data not to be stuck in silos, but not just corporate silos, but individuals holding on data and preventing it from being shared in ways that can answer public needs, And this is, I think, very important, for example, in biomedical research, for example. There's a lot of papers that have come out of the NIH, for example, recently talking about the effects of privacy regulations in certain jurisdictions, which make it very hard to share personal data on biomedical trials cross-border now, which significantly, which is an issue in terms of being able to get, accurate representative samples that are not just, biased according to particular national populations. So there are these kind of questions and tensions, I think, that will be coming up as well as we think about what are the right mechanisms to make this data economy work.
Great. Thanks so much. So I want to shift gears a little bit to talking more about the regulations around data. So there's several questions in the Q&A around this topic. So let me just try and hit the highlights from them, and as you gather your thoughts around this. So particularly thinking about the potential of so from Joel Blitt, for example, from a policy perspective, should we not encourage the free flow of data subject to privacy constraints? For example, perhaps data ownership should expire after 5 years and be made publicly available, much like patents or ideas. But then, others are asking, Jonathan Brown, how do business find the regulatory stability they need to plan future investments when they only have a 5-year window? For example, central banks guaranteeing agency for low interest rates for the next 10 years. And then, also thinking about, how could you maintain incentives by paying copyright to individual data generators whose value is extricated when collected and analyzed by companies? So I think all of these are related to some of the comments Jan made before about incentives, but also like what's the role of regulation in all of this as well. I don't know, Jan, maybe you want to start?
Sure. I think there's an inherent tension here in the micro nature. When we think of intellectual property, I mean, we're usually protecting things that they're kind of more discrete decisions. I mean, they're bigger ticket items. In the data economy, it could be a data point might be, the fact that you used a Visa credit card to purchase your coffee in the morning. How much is that worth, right? And if you have to engage in a legal discussion about, do I want to sign over the rights of keeping track of the fact that I used a Visa credit card for my morning coffee, at the time of purchasing your coffee, clearly that's just going to be too cumbersome. So I think we need to, we do need to conceptualize how we can do this, how we get the incentives right, how we are distributing value equitably, but we can't do that without thinking about how is this going to be operationalized, right? I mean, when we're really talking about a million microtransactions per day for everyone, this can't become a thing that just dominates our lives. So I think that's a very tricky issue. I think copyright maybe I think there's insights that we can draw from intellectual property frameworks for data. But again, I think given the nature of these microtransactions, I think there's also limitations to how much we can depend on. Also, as I was saying, right, the fact that the data is generated by transactions involving many parties, adds layers of complexity on top of this, right? You used your Visa credit card for the morning coffee. Well, surely the person making the coffee is also sort of party to that information, and so does it really belong to you, the customer, or is it something that's shared? These are questions that I think are just very difficult. I don't have all the answers, unfortunately.
Vikram or Brenda, do you have any thoughts around data regulation you wanted to share? Vikram?
I could just maybe add one remark. I mean, I think these things are quite difficult. And I think, there are approaches to thinking about data management which are focused on individual rights. And GDPR is a very important example of that, which I think has, received a lot of scrutiny and support. Maybe just two remarks. I think Jan's point about the micro nature of many of these transactions, like how much is my Starbucks purchase worth? The fact that I like a tall pike, that fact, how much is it worth? And is it something that a market mechanism can capture and auction? My guess is that so there are some people in this space who make arguments along the lines that maybe it is possible to find technological solutions to keeping track of those kind of transactions and competing in the market. The World Economic Forum has written about this. They take, I believe, they take a parallel to thinking about DRM, digital rights management software. Now, whether there's a scale issue, right? It's very different when we're in the space of talking about intellectual property that fits in within the classic patents right, or media, Taylor Swift's library of songs, and these are very big, chunky things that are worth a lot, But again, there's my tall pike order. Does it fit into the same thing, or is it just that, well, actually the technology is such that it can be scaled in such a way that it's easy to capture the value of my tall pike order and aggregate it and figure out that, well, my tall pike order is actually worth 0.001 cents. But to Starbucks is actually worth 1 cent, whatever. So I think that that the scale issue is there, but there may be avenues to consider in terms of technological solutions to agglomerating and managing that kind of information with some kind of DRM type solution. The other sort of policy piece that we've had some discussion about is the notion of what Jan and I like to refer to as data fiduciaries. So the argument here is this, that, and maybe we make a separation between important data and less important data. Maybe you can't have a fiduciary on your tall pike order, but what about my decision to refinance my house, where the data is potentially, that data is quite valuable actually, and potentially much more so than my tall pike order. So maybe we'd have a data. You could think of a data fiduciary as somebody as an entity that is given, maybe for a fee basis, a role in helping individuals manage their data and manage the consent to the trading of their data as well. There are mechanisms like this that are being considered, that are contemplated in many existing data privacy regimes. They're typically, if you, for example, use in the United States, where there's not a particularly clear regime on this so far, but if you use a product like Mint, for example, which agglomerates all the different financial accounts that you have, very nice, very useful for you, maybe as an individual. But it's basically the way that model works is that the fiduciary, in this case Mint, who's aggregating all of your financial account data, and in some senses at your behest, managing consent for different types of transactions, they're effectively able to monetize that data and offer you services. So whether that's a model that you want, or whether you want a model where really it's on a contingency basis or a fee basis, and there's sort of Chinese walls between the fiduciary and the data subject, I think are questions which are also quite interesting. But I think those to my mind, those are two. The rights management and the data fiduciary are two avenues to think about in terms of actually coming up with an effective, feasible data rights management regime.
Great, thanks, Vikram. I think that really connects in with another theme that I'm seeing in the questions coming in from the audience which is around the value of linking disparate data sets versus these individual units of data, and how to think about that value and how to value that. Is there a way to think about that rather than just increasing the scale and scope of data collected and exploited, but the particular values you get from joining data sets that might be useful for a firm to develop a new product or to target it at you from a marketing perspective, knowing that people who like the tall pike from Starbucks also like a certain kind of donut that might tell Starbucks what kind of new product to have. And so, but just thinking about like those particular gains in value, I don't know, Brenda, is that something that y'all have thought about at all in terms of valuing data and in terms of those particular kinds of linking of different data sets?
For us, I think we kind of look at it as a data point in isolation is not very meaningful. And someone would not actually go through the effort of collecting one simple observation. So when Vikram goes to buy his coffee, that might not be very interesting. But put that together with 6 months of Vikram buying his coffee, or 6 months of everybody buying their coffee, then I think you can get a lot more information. So I think it's more the collective use of the data rather than the single observation data point that's the valuable piece.
Sorry, Jan, I'm nodding at you, but I think that part of Zoom is not well developed yet for you to catch my eye contact there.
So I just wanted to preface this, in my understanding in Canada and in the US, I mean, there are very strict rules that prevent, government agencies to map data about individuals across departments. So your immigration data cannot find its way to like police department and to your health data. We have strict rules for ring fencing those data, keeping them separate because of exactly what you're saying, right? The power, the insights that one can derive from data get multiplied when we're able to merge data sets across and link them to individuals. I think it's notable that we have those limitations in the public sector and yet have basically none in the private sector, right? So I mean, that I think is a place to start a conversation. We already, in our public policy, admit that this is a real issue that we need to deal with in the public sector, but yet in the private sector, it's kind of a free-for-all, right? And I think one way in which the private sector has taken advantage of that, I think, has sought to create a lot of value through agglomeration of data, is in the creation of digital IDs. And in the US and Canada, the closest we kind of have to digital IDs to this day are still just in the private sector, right? Like your Gmail account, your Facebook account. I mean, this is the way we authenticate ourselves across the internet. And that gives those companies that are providing that authentication and that identity verification service, it puts them right in the middle of all these data flows and gives them the ability to do this agglomeration task, which we see as so powerful. But we now see a lot of governments creating digital ID systems, and there's been a lot of work on this at the OECD on setting standards for how this should be done. And we've now seen some countries operationalizing this. Vikram and I have written about the experience in India, where they've created a digital ID system that now covers over 1 billion people, and you can use it both for it's your biometrically linked identity. That can be your link to the financial sector, but also to government services and the provision of benefits and things like that. Also in other applications in the private sector, and that means that we can set rules about when data can and cannot be agglomerated based on sort of public objectives, as well as just when it's commercially convenient to do so. And so I think that's a really important tool of public policy that countries need to work on really actively.
Tara, if I can just complement that. So if the question was about, well, how would we have sort of cross movement of data from different sectors across different sectors or different data sets? So, this also, I mean, this ties into another aspect of data, right? So the whole issue of the data silo, that basically the big platforms that accumulate data have no incentive to share it, right? Because it's a source of their competitive advantage. So there's a competition policy issue out here. And I think that competition policy issue ties in with the question that you posed, because one of the solutions to the competition policy issue is to try to crack open the silo. And the mechanisms that could be used for that, one is data portability, another one would be interoperability of systems. So it depends on where you think the barrier to entry or the competitive advantage comes from. Does it come from the data, in which case it would be a data portability solution, or is it from the network itself, the platform itself, in which case you really want to make the platforms interoperable? There's, the specific example out here is many jurisdictions have undertaken what they call open banking reforms. So the idea is that banks have a lot of private information about their customers, which they hold on to as a source of great competitive advantage for banks. And banks, of course, do good things with that. They analyze the customers, they're able to give loans, they take risk, etc. But the idea of open banking is that we have new fintech entrants coming in to provide financial services, and they don't have the existing customer networks. They don't have the existing customer data. So why don't we make this data portable and require banks to basically provide on request and with the authorization of the individuals considered, the data that the banks have to these new entrants. So that's within sectors, but you can imagine that same idea from a regulatory perspective of open banking being extended to, say, imagine you could think of open finance and say, well, why just amongst banks? Let's have this across different sectors within the financial sector business. Maybe we would have a situation where, if you were a new entrant providing insurance services, you'd be able to request data from a bank or some other financial intermediary about the individual customers so that you might be able to offer them a better deal, better rate. Geico is competing with State Farm on insurance. Maybe you get a better deal from Geico if they can now access the data that State Farm actually has on their existing customers. So, I don't think that there's a particularly clear view yet about right or wrong, particularly in the financial services space, where there's significant stability issues we worry about and we regulate quite heavily. But these are among the kind of questions that I think come up with in terms of how you can move data around from across different sectors and what some of the public policy interventions that are being experimented with right now are currently focused on.
Great, thanks. So we've had a question come in that I think points out an important topic that we haven't yet covered. So we've been very focused on the data created and about humans, but there's lots of other types of data out there: scientific, geological, engine performance, and so Joel Blitt asks, should we think differently about these other data since there's no tension between privacy and public good aspects? Now, I'm not necessarily in agreement that there's no tension there between the privacy and public good aspects, even of those non-human types of data, but I'd love to know how y'all are thinking about other types of data. Does it make any difference from any of the frameworks that you're thinking about, whether this is human actions or other types of data? And Brenda, does it make a difference in terms of how you're thinking about it from an accounting perspective?
No, from the economic accounting, it would be the same, whether it be the generation of farming data or Vikram buying his coffee. We're looking at it the same way. And I do think that, either way, you will have, I think you would have some tension, even who captures that it's sunny today in Ottawa. Maybe you will have some tension arising if you have a different regulatory framework for that versus other types of data.
So I think one thing to say is that most countries that have passed data protection laws in the last sort of 5-10 years make a very clear distinction between personal data, so this is data that can be mapped to an individual, and other data. And in some ways, there's important issues with both groups of data. That's for sure. But there are a different set of issues with personal data, and I think in the question, the person who's posed the question has put their finger on the main one, which is that there aren't privacy implications of using data that can't be linked to an individual. So I think, one thing to say sort of in a very broad strokes is that to the extent that this is, engine performance information that's not linked to any particular driver, there's probably a very strong, public interest in having that data being widely shared. Now, of course, there's going to still be commercial interests in not having it be widely shared, and so there's a question of, balancing those interests, and incentives needs to play a key role. Who has spent the money to measure this data? Who is spending the money to store it? Let's make sure we have incentives so that data continues to be produced. But from a macro perspective, it would be nice if all the car companies could get access to it and use it to make all of their engines better. Right? That I think is a simpler problem to solve than one where you also have an individual behind the data who is being affected through privacy channels, and that just adds many layers of complexity to the equation.
Yeah, I think that's a great question, actually. And I think, as Jan mentioned, it's really about if you were able to identify the person, right? So take my Geico example. So if you have a BMW which is monitoring your driving, now BMW may have 500,000 cars on the road in the United States, and it's accumulating this data of driving habits and driving patterns, and they use that to optimize the gear shift ratios that the automatic transmissions are basically using, which they do, by the way. This is data where it's not really for them. It's not valuable about the individual. The individual identification is less important. Actually, the aggregate behavior is more important. But if you then take that same data, which is in principle, could be individually identifiable because they know the owners of each of these cars, right? And then say that, well, this now tells you the habit of, do you speed, do you accelerate, do you brake very hard, which might be quite informative to an insurance provider. So where do you draw the line on that particular issue? And I think that comes up as well. So that's where the privacy and the need to have agency over the appropriate use of your data becomes important. And if BMW wants to use my data to sell it to Geico to give better insurance, well, then maybe they should pay me a piece for it. Maybe I don't want them to be able to do that, right? Maybe I'm a scary kind of a driver. But I think it also goes back to the biomedical example as well, right? Because again, we have individual data, which may be collected in the context of a medical trial, which maybe individuals would not consent to having that data shared from Europe with some researchers in the United States. But if it could be adequately anonymized, maybe then they would be more comfortable. So you would satisfy both the privacy requirement, but also satisfying the benefits that you could get from the non-rivalry and against the scale of having large amounts of individual data to find new drugs or better solutions to diabetes or whatever the case may be, actually. So there's, it's like a bit of a rabbit hole out here, Tara, because the moment you think you solve one particular thing, another thing comes up and people, no. So on anonymization, right, people ask questions, well, can you really have, foolproof anonymization with quantum computing coming down the road? There's nothing that you can't, maybe we'll have a world where there's no hash that can't be broken. So there are those kind of considerations as well.
Great. Well, thank you all so much on that. There are still several great questions in the Q&A, but we are almost out of time. So I'd like to use these last couple of minutes just to do a quick round the room again for any last points you'd like to make or encouragements for future directions for research on this topic. Like where should we be investing our scarce time and thinking about data? Who has their first thought? Vikram, you want to go first on that one?
Yeah, I just wanted to maybe pick up on something that Jan had been talking about early on, which is about the US-China question. And just to say, from the IMF is an organization with a universal membership representing over 189 countries, I believe, at this point. And I think that the international use of data is an important topic. And I think it's an important question to keep in mind of while we're all focused on our individual jurisdictions and our own individual rights. I think it's a big question about providing access to small, emerging, and developing countries to the data markets of the advanced economies, so that they have access to be able to use the data to develop their own products and services. And frankly, in some cases, when they're selling products and services to the advanced jurisdictions, the cost of complying with some of the data requirements that advanced jurisdictions may institute for their own purposes is something that has to be kept in mind. So it's just a call that I think as we talk about the data economy, it's I think important to think about it also from the global international perspective, and to think about the fact that we need to figure out accommodations also for big and small members of the global community so that we are able to have a global data economy that works for everybody.
Great. Brenda, do you have any last thoughts you want to share?
No, just to say thanks for inviting me. This is great. I know myself, I'm very intrigued by the idea of measuring cross-border transactions in data. And I'm interested to see what kind of research actually comes out of some different areas with regards to the transactions.
Jan, last words from you?
Yeah, I mean, I would just say we clearly, based on our remarks, you can tell the things that we write, we think this is a really important area of inquiry for macroeconomic policy for a number of reasons. And I think a call for future research, the theoretical research is really lighting up. There's some empirical work, but it's on very narrow questions. And so I think a general observation is just to say that given that we're talking about data, it's surprising how hard it is to do quantitative research on this question, right? Like when we say there's financial stability implications, well, how big are they, right? When we say there's competition implications, well, can we measure these things? And I think policymakers, that's what we need, right? As we make these big decisions about how to set the new rules for the data economy. If you can't measure trade-offs, it's easy to get things wrong. So I think we do need a lot of research there.
Well, that's a fantastic lesson. I think that I'm going to take away from this discussion is that we're going to measure more about data. It seems like an important direction to go in. So thank you all so much. And I will pass it back over to Susan.
And we need to reduce the opacity of data, particularly at the firm level. So at some point soon, we're going to have a webinar on the microeconomics of data. And we already have one great speaker. And if anyone wants to email me any other suggestions, I look forward to hearing it. However, our next webinar in May will be on interoperability of data protection regimes. And so we'll be looking at various regional perspectives on that. So thank you all so much for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you again soon. And ideas for webinars, if you need training, please contact us. We do it for free. Thank you all for coming, and have a great day or night or morning or whatever. Bye. Thank you, Tara. Thank you, speakers.